And I'm turning it over to Ian Noakes to facilitate that session. Ian, take it away.
Thank you, Janice. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ian Noakes. I'm a farm policy analyst in OFA's research department, and I'll be facilitating this next session by Jenn MacTavish on farm mortality management and LRIC study. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items for anyone that's just joined the webinar. As attendees, your microphone and camera are turned off. You can type any questions you have into the chat box, and we'll get to those questions after the presentation slides. If time is constrained, any questions that we don't answer, we'll follow up with communication. Everyone has an option to leave and rejoin the meeting throughout the day to attend any presentations that you have a particular interest in. There will be a recording of the presentation made available on OFA's website after the event. So now I am pleased to introduce Jenn MacTavish. Jenn is recognized in the farm sector as a strategic thinker and a real problem solver. For 9.5 years as general manager of the Ontario Sheep Farmers, Jenn developed quite a reputation as a trusted partner with expertise in government relations, board governance, program development, domestic policy, and business risk management. And as a dedicated leader with 20 years experience, Jenn is honored to have been working with teams, boards, industry partners to develop and achieve goals within this agricultural industry. Jenn will present information today on a report she's finalizing with the Livestock Research Innovation Corporation on the state of livestock support systems. Good morning, Jenn, and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you, Ian. I'll just get my presentation up here for everyone. It's a bit awkward, I think, giving a presentation on farm mortality right after a lovely presentation on agritourism. This is probably the side of farming you don't really want tourists to see. Before I get started, there's just a couple of housekeeping items in relation to this presentation. The first one is that there is not a final report yet, so this work is ongoing. So as you're listening to this, if you think of things that you want to make sure get included in this report that you think I may have forgotten but need to remember, or people that you think I should be speaking to, please put that in the chat and provide your thoughts that way. At the end of the presentation, I will have my email address so you can contact me directly. The second thing is there's a lot of work currently happening with industries and government on managing mass casualty events or animal health disease outbreaks. This presentation does not cover that part of on-farm mortality management. This is specifically around your day-to-day management of dead stock or fallen stock, which brings me to my third point. As I've been interviewing people for this work, there's been a lot of discussion on the words we're using and if they're resonating properly with people, and how to encourage discussion around how we manage mortalities without using language that can be off-putting, if you will. And this feedback's coming from farmers and renderers and government across the board. So I'm trying out different language, fallen stock being one of them, which is a term I have poached from the UK. And so your feedback even on what kind of language you feel comfortable using when we talk about fallen stock, dead stock, on-farm mortalities, carcasses, whatever, is also greatly appreciated. So to get us into the presentation this morning, the first thing I want to talk about is what drove the need to do this work, to do this research. And over the past about 3 years or 4, there have been restrictions in terms of on-farm pickup services in the province of Ontario. So some renderers or service providers have restricted the area in which, excuse me, they'll go and pick up dead stock. There's also escalating costs for pickup companies, for labor, for fuel, for running the trucks, for finding parts for the trucks. It's all becoming a bit expensive for them. And then some companies have indicated that they will no longer pick up dead stock that have been euthanized using barbiturates, which is another restriction on the service provided. And so there was some discussion around the livestock groups and OMAFRA to have a look at what can the industry do in terms of addressing the challenges they're facing on farm mortalities. And are there any opportunities out there that we should be looking at as an industry? So to provide you with a little bit more history, one of the questions I've been asking the people I've been speaking to is who should own the issue of dead stock? Who should champion it? There are some people who say that if you have livestock, you have dead stock and it's your issue, you manage it. And then other people are saying, well, there's 5 or 6 different regulations that impact how I can manage dead stock on my farm, whether it's a municipal bylaw or the provincial government or the federal government. And if the government's going to regulate us, the government should be supporting us. Most people think it's a shared jurisdiction. Everybody should have a say and a weight into how we manage dead stock. And in 1999, OMAFRA started that investment with their Healthy Futures program. And then you can see here that from 2019 on, there's just been this series of events that have really made managing dead stock more challenging. So Barrett Hides closed, Coney dead stock isn't picking up anymore. Atwood curtailed their pickup radius to 90 minutes from their plant in 2021. And you saw then that Ontario started investing more money into some services for on-farm solutions. And then in 2022, Sanimax is no longer accepting carcasses that were euthanized with barbiturates. And then the government put another financial investment into trying to figure out how to manage the concerns around on-farm mortalities. So to inform this work, interviews have been a large part of what I've been doing. And I've interviewed probably over 60 people, and I've tried to get a diverse a group as possible. So I've talked to OMAFRA and MECP, Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, OLPC, the livestock groups, including equine and aquaculture, Meat and Poultry Ontario, researchers across Canada, farmers, the renderers, private groups, private companies like Convertist and Barn Angels, Cornerstone Renewables, the renderers, municipal councillors. So as you can see here, I didn't have room to list everybody, but I'm trying to get a diverse an opinion as possible about how we should be managing our dead stock. This is a hard slide to read. I appreciate that. There's just a few things I want to point out. I'm trying to map out what are the issues and where in the province there might be issues. If you don't see your county or region listed, it's because you're in Central Ontario, which has the most municipalities listed. Right now, there is concern that there's certain areas of the province that are underserviced, and rightfully so. Eastern Ontario and Northern Ontario, 100% underserviced, but there are still some services available there. So Sanimax will come in, they'll pick up as far west into the province as Kingston, and they do have pickup services up into Temiskaming. I don't think they're going to go to Rainy River. They haven't indicated they'll go that far west. So there are different services or pickup people across the province. What's interesting though is that if you look at the number of animals, so dairy, beef, sheep, and hogs, the vast majority of our animals are in West and Central Ontario, and that's where you're going to find the vast majority of resources available, especially from private companies that are looking for that return on investment and they want to be close to the product that they're trying to get access to. So even though there are services listed for the East and the North, they might not be as available. It could be more sporadic to get that service. And then there's only 2 landfills in the province that currently accept routine mortalities. The landfills are engaged right now in a lot of discussions around mass mortality or mass casualty events. They are not really wanting to weigh into or delve into bringing in routine mortalities. There's concerns that they have around their current land availability and some of the bylaw restrictions they might have in their regions. And they're just not sure that it's where they want to spend more time and energy right now. In terms of a jurisdictional scan, we've looked at various different regions. So every province in Canada, the UK, Australia, California, Colorado, Minnesota, the European Union. And I don't know if it's good or bad news. So the news is that nobody has a silver bullet to manage on-farm mortalities. There's not something that's available in another part of the world that I've been able to uncover to date that isn't already offered in Ontario. And in fact, in most cases, Ontario has more options than other jurisdictions. So in the UK, for instance, dead stock pickup is your only option. That's it, that's all. And a lot of that stemmed out of their foot and mouth disease outbreak back in the early 2000s. There are some options. So in Australia, if you're in the outback and it's warm, which is most of the time, then you can leave said carcass where you found it, which is not an option that we have in Ontario. But for the most part, burial, composting, incineration, to a lesser extent landfill, are all options in all jurisdictions. And rendering is always the preferred option, which is interesting considering rendering is the option that most people are having difficulty getting access to, regardless of jurisdiction. It's getting more costly to have renderers operating. In some areas of Canada, for instance, especially in Eastern Canada, they have rendering options available for poultry. But if you have especially ruminants, you are getting those carcasses shipped into Quebec for processing. The SRM and mad cow disease issue through a monkey wrench in dead stock pickup globally. And so disposing of cattle is definitely one of the stumbling blocks when we're talking about on-farm mortalities. So interestingly, we talk a lot about cost when it comes to mortality management, on-farm mortality management. What we haven't talked about, or what I don't hear talked about a lot in Ontario, but is talked about in other regions, is what are the environmental impacts of dead stock management. And so this is a summary of work that was done out of Wales, looking at the environmental impacts of the top 4 disposal options. And so you can see here that burial has very little when done properly. So all of this has a caveat: when done properly. Very few issues around odor or greenhouse gas. It's okay for air pollution. It's got the potential to have poor soil outcomes and moderate water outcomes. Burial, however, is easy, tends to be inexpensive, but the site is critical. You'll see that even in Ontario. I had one person from the government say, Ontario farmers don't need to worry because they can bury their on-farm deads. And I'm like, except for when they can't, when the land is frozen, when they're in tile drainage, when they don't have soil that accommodates burial very well. And if you talk to pork producers who've been mapping out where they can bury their on-farm deads, they're left with like a small section of their farm that is suitable, which isn't going to be accommodating for very long. So as much as we like burial, it doesn't tend to be the option, the sort of panacea option that everybody thinks it might be. Incineration isn't so bad for odor. It's poor for greenhouse gas emissions. So for those who are worried about emissions, incineration has a bit of a black mark against it. But it tends to be good, no real impact on air, soil, and water. Composting, I have to tell you, is a fan favorite. Again, with the caveat when done properly. So putting a carcass in a manure pile is not composting. But when you have it set up properly on a concrete pad, you're maintaining a high temperature, high enough to kill pathogens, you're turning it often, then it really is very good in terms of odor and greenhouse gas. There's more research needed around whether or not there's some air pollution, and it might have a moderate impact on soil. And there is a product at the end that you can use. There are, around cattle, there are some issues there. But for the most part, everybody I've spoken to likes this idea of composting. And then there's rendering, which is, moderately okay for odor. In Ontario, they've got a lot of scrubbers that they're using to minimize odor. It's pretty decent for greenhouse gas. It's very good in terms of, no impact on the soil. There might be moderate impacts on water. However, when you talk to the renderers in Ontario, they when you talk to the added costs they have for rendering, they pay to treat all the water that's produced from the carcasses that come in. They pay to hold all that water, and then they pay to have it tested, and then they pay to release it back into our environment. So they're actually providing a water source for us. And when water could become a critical point for agriculture, this could make it a really interesting partnership between renderers and farmers. But the renderers are paying to ensure that the water that they're putting back into the environment as a resource is clean enough to go back into the environment, which is interesting for us. There was also some research done out of India looking at the direct cost indicators for the four top methods for managing dead stock, and then the indirect. And this brings up an interesting point in the discussion, which is this One Health concept. So when we're looking at how we're managing dead stock, how are those management options impacting our environment, our wildlife? So we're seeing this right now when you see some mammals scavenging on birds that have died from H5N1, and it's being the disease is now being transferred into the mammals. And how's it affecting human health? So this One Health concept is really coming in to the discussion, as is this whole idea of public perception or social license. And again, I raised the example of foot and mouth disease in the UK, which brought an end because of the public outlash. It brought an end to incineration being an option for carcass disposal. So it's just some things we need to keep in mind when we're talking about how we're going to manage our on-farm mortalities. Interestingly enough, I'm starting to wonder if there's a point where we can leverage this One Health concept. One of the things that really I find interesting in doing this research was the amount of research going on right now in terms of carcass disposal is not happening in livestock. It's happening in the human sphere. So coming out of COVID, over 100 countries across the world had to deal with mass human carcass disposal issues. So it just brings to mind the refrigerated trailers that they had outside hospitals in New York City. And how can we, keeping One Health in mind, how can we effectively manage human carcass disposal, which is a bit of an uncomfortable conversation, perhaps. The research that's going on there, though, is looking at what we do in livestock agriculture. And so if there is funding available, maybe that's a partnership we could be doing. It could be a way to sort of tap into a whole discussion around what is deemed acceptable or unacceptable for how we manage carcasses. And I still have not figured out a way to talk about that without getting a bit uncomfortable myself. So it's just an interesting little sidebar that I've been thinking about as we've been doing this, is the parallel between how we're managing human carcasses and animal carcasses. So in terms of a bit of a SWOT analysis for what's happening in Ontario, the good news is that we have the support of the government, we have their ear, they want to have these discussions. We have flexibility and choice in Ontario. None of those choices are 100%. Not all of them are really all that interesting, or feasible. But we can bury, we can compost, we can incinerate. We have disposal vessels that are really good for small ruminants in particular. We can bury them in the ground and put the carcasses in. There are a number of options, anaerobic digestion as well. So we do have some choice. We do have groups, poultry and hogs in particular, that are already at a table discussing how they're going to manage on-farm mortalities. And they've brought together a really diverse group of people to do that. But these discussions have not happened across all of livestock. So there are some lessons we can learn for poultry and hogs, but they're discussions we need to start having, especially in the cattle sector where disposal is a bit more challenging. So what are those lessons learned? And we've lost, I feel that we've lost sight of the fact that dead stock has value. So in addition to renderers being able to, put water back into our waterways, dead stock can provide compost and fertilizer for our land. The the poultry and hog sector, at least they can provide protein sources for other livestock or our pets. There is a value here that we haven't really been chatting about that needs to come into the conversation. So in terms of weaknesses, I think we have a lack of coordinated approach. It seems to be everybody's at the table for themselves, and some decisions are getting made based on misinformation or not really appreciating the nuances. So for instance, I might call somebody and they'll tell me, you know, X, Y, and Z happens. And then when I call someone else, they're like, no, that never happens. So there just doesn't seem to be a consistent approach. The best example would be, as a farmer, I might call OMAFRA and get advice on how to dispose of something. But when I call MECP, I get a completely different answer. So there's always this sort of lack of coordinated approach. We do have, despite the government investment of late, there is a overall lack of investment into research and looking at other options for disposal. And then what adds to all the confusion is just the sheer number of regulations that are impacting on-farm disposal of dead stock. The threats are ones you've heard already this morning. Even like we have problems with labor, so even getting drivers to be dead stock collectors is a problem. Profitability is an issue. Market access is an issue, especially as people's choices for products change. So that's really impacted the hide sector the most, where people aren't wearing leather anymore or using leather as often. And then the cost and the regulation. But all is not lost. We do have some options and opportunities. So I'll get into those as well here. Before that, I'm going to chat to you a little bit about what is happening around the economics. So part of what we've looked at is what are the byproducts and economics of dead stock collection. And so we know that from hogs and poultry, we can get fat and protein byproducts. From the cattle side, it's just fat. And the majority of this is going into biofuels. The combined biodiesel, renewable, and diesel production doubled since 2015. So there is a growing demand here. And some of the plants have actually gotten to the point where the diesel that they are generating can go right into the fossil fuel diesel line because they're the same quality now. So they don't even have to be separated. And then based on the 2021 estimates, the yellow grease accounted for about 74% of feedstock consumed and about 5% in biodiesel. So there is a growing market here. But as I said earlier, there are concerns around the economics. So running a truck can cost you anywhere from $150 to $175 an hour. And the approximate value from any one pickup route is about $1,150. So in the final report, what we're hoping to do is create radiuses so that people can actually visualize if a renderer is here, what's the radius that they could pick up at to be economically viable for them. So we can get a visualization from that. And the one thing I forgot to mention that I'll throw in here is that I would encourage people to appreciate that even if we had multiple dead stock pickup service providers, we don't have that same luxury of choice when it comes to renderers. So even if you had an independent dead stock pickup provider picking up for you in Rainy River, their choices of where to put that product are still limited. So they're still coming into either Darling, Rothsay, or Atwood. Like, we don't have a lot of choice for that final product, which is part of the problem as well. I mentioned hides earlier. It is part of the work that we're doing, and nobody currently is picking up hides or collecting hides. A small percentage of them will go into Europe or China. They have to come out of federally inspected plants, though. And Meat and Poultry Ontario estimates that we have about 100,000 hides per year that are produced. 90% of them are heading into the landfill, which is a huge waste problem. Okay, so after all of that, let's chat a little bit about what some of the recommendations that we're chatting about might be. So one of the ideas people had was a crown corporation, a group that will quarterback all issues dead stock. I'm not sure we need to create another crown corporation. It might be better to tap an existing organization on the shoulder and say, hey, can you do this? But I do believe that we do need somebody being some group, who can quarterback the issue of dead stock, can coordinate what's going on with all the regulations, can be a one-stop shop for people who might have questions, can identify research needs. But I think there is some benefit to that. We've had some discussion around centralized collection. So if we can't have dead stock pickup for all farmers, can farmers bring dead stock to one point and then have the dead stock collector come and pick it up from that one point? Poultry and hogs, the farmers who farm poultry and hogs have said, no way. I am not driving my dead stock to a place where there is more dead stock of unknown dead reason and not knowing what I'm bringing back onto my farm. The biosecurity is just not worth it, that risk. They don't want to do it. When I talk to other like landfill sites or transfer stations, I'm like, would this be something that you'd be interested in? And there's like, what's in it for us? Will our bylaws approve it? Do I need another ECA? And what's the biosecurity going to be? So while this isn't necessarily off the table, there's definitely a need to really dive into how to make this happen in a way that's efficient and has a return on investment. Because one of the things that kind of struggling with is if we create a centralized collection, it might need to be manned, because when I hear centralized collection, I think of the clothes drop-in bins where you can put the clothes you want to donate and then it overflows. And the last thing we want is a drop-in bin that overflows with dead stock. So if we're going to put all the infrastructure around for a centralized collection, do we have enough dead stock to get that return on investment to make that worthwhile for us? The other option is to look at working with waste management companies. So groups like Convertus, which are big composters for composting companies for food waste, for instance, they don't take livestock or dead stock. And they'd be interested in doing it, but they have to work, they need some help or want some help working with the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks around navigating all the ECAs and all the environmental requirements they'd have, especially around odor. Odor seems to be a big one that comes up. There's also issues around that not in my backyard, NIMBYism, when we look at land use and land use requirements. And then of course the Nutrient Management Act, we'd have to look at that too. So there's interest there. We would just have to get a group around a table to talk about it. I have producer education down. I'm struggling with that term. I don't know if I like it, but basically what I'd encourage us to do is start thinking about how we can do that culture change. I can appreciate that as a livestock farmer, you have a laundry list of priorities in a day, and that dead animal that's not making you any money anymore is not at the top of your list. Like, it's human nature, but there is value in that dead animal. And so how can we change the conversation to get more buy-in? So what are the benefits of it? And can we build a business case for diversity of income? So even when I talk to some people about, if I compost properly and I have good compost at the end of it that I can spread on my land, what does that equate to in terms of what I won't be spending on fertilizer? And nobody's been able to date to point me in the direction where I can find that kind of information. I also think there's a need for some relationship building. We have to bring everybody to the table. So when I worked for the sheep industry, we were guilty of this. I can appreciate that there might be other groups that are guilty of this as well. But when we're building programs around how to manage dead stock, how many of us had renderers at the table for that discussion? How many best management practices are out there saying that you have to have your dead stock picked up within 48 hours of it passing away? And yet the dead stock pickup is either out of business or restricted its service area. And what does that mean for our farmers? So how do we bring everybody to the table to have a more robust discussion and get better outcomes for all of us? I also think the waste management companies and the renderers could use some help in terms of how to promote the benefits that they have to society and the circular economy. They have all indicated they don't really want to talk about it. Nobody really wants to. It's not a nice topic, but there is a good news story here that could help when they're trying to engage the government. And then looking for some stable funding for research and finding ways to help offset the cost of disposal. So I don't know how I'm doing for time. I feel like I'm just sort of rambling. I'm just going to keep going, Janet and Ian, until you tell me to stop. So just some of the funding that I think we could be looking at in terms of helping our farmers, and some of the hoops we might need to jump through. There are portable incinerators that are available in other areas. I've been chatting with MECP to find out where they are in Ontario. Apparently there's 4 of them, but they do need to be certified under ETV Canada. And that certification is expensive. One of the quotes I got was $75,000. And it basically means the incinerators are certified up to like medical grade incineration. So there could be an ROI here in terms of whether or not this is feasible. And they use a lot of fuel. So a 2009 study out of British Columbia, and I just did the, hey, Google, what would today's prices be given inflation, said that the amount of fuel needed to preheat an incinerator range from 64 liters to 75 liters. So that can get very costly. However, they will run about $500,000 if we, depending on the size. This is obviously a smaller sized one. It would be tricky to get an entire cow carcass in there. But it is an option we could look at. Large scale composting. So Barn Angels is a service that's currently provided that does provide large scale composting, and they have a vast pickup range across the province. They started doing composting for small animal veterinarians and for the horse industry. They have also done quick rapid composting for avian influenza for some chicken barns, and worked with those chicken farmers to set up biosecurity methods. They've been CFIA certified to compost SRM material of late, and they're located actually, if you're driving east on the 401, they're just north of the Highway 25 cutoff. So sort of in between Milton and Georgetown is where their current location is. And so they are looking to expand their client base and take on livestock of all livestock. The biggest challenge if you're going to compost on farm is substrate availability. The bylaws in certain areas you have to be mindful of, and then of course land availability. There has to be a land mass for that. We've also looked at biodigesters. So there's about 14 biodigesters currently being studied by OMAFRA throughout the province. They do not take dead stock though. It's just manure and food compost, organic compost of another nature. There are some issues around how you can use the substrate that comes out of a biodigester. So there's some issues around your manure units, depending on the Nutrient Management Act. MECP has their ECAs that are required. It could be an option for some fallen stock. Cattle will be the issue here, because the cattle will have to be macerated and pre-treated through a thermohydrolysis in order to be put into the biodigester to ensure that all the prions have been destroyed. And then there's a company called BioVator out of Manitoba, and they have these long tubes that you can use for rapid composting. So you put the animal in at one end, or the carcass in at one end, and it churns, and out the other end you get compost. They come in 6 sizes. They're pricey though. They range from $20,000 to $140,000. They're really primarily targeting hogs and poultry. The cattle will need to be dismembered in some way to be able to fit in. So that is a bit of a downside, even with the largest size they have. Interestingly, they said they're not used well for sheep because the wool doesn't compost well. But when I talked to some sheep farmers, they've sent me some photos. I didn't have time to get them put up into today's presentation that show that the compost is coming out without any wool there. There are some bones that you just pick up and put back into the top of the composter, but the wool doesn't seem to be a problem for the farmers. Okay, so I appreciate that was a lot of information. I ran through it really quickly, but if you have any questions or comments or want to get in touch with me individually, here is my contact, and I'll turn it over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Jen. That was a very informative, I guess, scope of what's out there right now and the challenges that we have. There's quite a few questions, but I've got to say you did a very good presentation. I think you've answered most of these during the presentation, but I'll start off with a general one. So there are many critical industries we rely on in the farm sector to get food to customers. Access to vets and the other dead and livestock issues you've mentioned, retail markets, labor issues, and even international trade. We have little or no influence over them. You mentioned the government, the provincial government is interested in this issue that you brought up today. Is this something that we can ask the province to review and see whether they should intervene? Or is it really something that they're more likely to say it's up to the open market to do?
Yeah, so yes. One of the things that I've been really trying to figure out how to put words to is this. It came out during COVID, this idea of an essential service, and all aspects of food production were essential services except for the renderers. And if the renderers go out of business for whatever reason, for longer than 24 hours, our processors, I apologize for my dog. She has a lot to say about this. Our processors have to stop processing animals. So the fact that the renderers were not included in that essential service struck me as quite odd, given they're a linchpin in the whole market, in the whole chain. So I think to answer your question, we got to figure out how I'm going to word that into the recommendations for the government, but there has to be a discussion around them being an essential service and how to keep them in business and operating. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks for that. I will comment. The reason I'm wearing these headphones is my dogs are eager to comment as well. So there's a few questions here that I think you've touched on, but maybe just for closing statements. In areas with no or little options, how do we get closed landfills and transportations to accept dead stock for collection to ship to a facility? And following up on that is, I guess, another question. Do we have a place where the dead stock can be brought to the central bio plant and create energy or something of that sort? So you've kind of touched on those, but if you want to just summarize the challenges.
I'll add in that some of that's already happening. So Sanimax has a collection point in St. Albert already, but they don't allow individual farmers to bring the products to that collection point. So they'll go and pick it up and bring it to their own collection point. And again, because from their perspective, there's a couple of issues, biosecurity, but also the risk of injury to the farmers as they're dropping things off, like the liability risk to that. So thank you for asking that question, because I did forget to mention it in the presentation. It is a tricky one for us to get our minds around. How can we do this in a way, again, going back to that, biosecurity issue, human environmental health issue.
I've got a comment about you talked about certification and the cost of that. Why is it so expensive? It seems not to make any sense.
I haven't dived into that. Great question. It's still part of the problem, which is a good problem to have, is that the amount of time I have to do the work and the amount of work I could do for the project. And I just haven't had time to dive into some of these big ones. So that could be in my parking lot. Let's figure out why we're charging this much. And do we need to be charging? There's some things that seem really ridiculous for us to charge for, like the whole water, which is a resource, and we're charging the renderers to make that available to us, which just seems really weird to me.
So there's a comment that I'll add right now. You mentioned the security risks and maybe injury risks if farmers were to be involved in actually bringing their livestock to a central location and just disposing of it there. Considering Ian MacDonald's presentation earlier this morning on precision ag, maybe we can get robots to do that for us. Just drop it right to the robot.
Yeah, absolutely. That could be part of the research recommendations. Find the robots.
And one other comment, I guess, you mentioned incinerators and the pollution risk of that. And it's difficult, again, with the scale of these animals. They're thousands of pounds, hundreds of pounds. Is there any interest in using something like pyrolysis for these, for the disposal of this, you know, to make syncrude and have no odors or, you know, pollution from that? Or is it the scale and I guess the moisture content? Does that present a challenge?
I honestly don't know. I'll have to check. I'll check it out though. Yeah, I have no idea.
I've got just one or two more questions right here, and then I'll check the chat box again. Are the provincial arbiters, do they have less? Oh, they have less quality than the federal arbiters. Why is there a difference? And would it not help the industry if they were all, federally regulated?
So I'm assuming that question is in relation to the hides. So right now, regardless of whether renderers will pick up from plants, from abattoirs, regardless of federal or provincial. So it's the hides that are the issue in terms of exports. And so I would just kind of doing the mental gymnastics here. We don't export to other countries our provincially inspected meat. So it would sort of fall to reason that we don't export to other countries our provincially inspected hides.
Well, I'm trying to see the last question I can find here right now, or that we can get to. I just have one comment. There seems to be a lot of interest in collagen, the layer between the hide and the flesh, and there's quite a niche market for that in this day and age. I think China is they're taking over the donkey market for a specialized collagen worldwide. Is there any potential that this could be a niche market and also be a profit center for these animals?
Yeah, 100%. Like it's another product. Yeah. I also told them, like, I have a dog. My dog has a special dietary need that we need pancreases for her. And sometimes we run out of that. So if they wanted to look at providing pancreases for special need diet, I'd be their #1 customer.
And I guess I have a follow-up on the abattoir question. Yeah. So, I mean, this is not just for hides. There's a comment following up. It's not just for hides. Why the difference between provincial and federal, I guess, stringency? I don't know if you can answer that really, but.
Yeah, not in the scope of this project. There's lots of, it is a bone of contention, if you will, for all of the livestock sector. I know, but I don't appreciate the regulatory difference myself. So
okay, that sounds great. So that's terrific. Thank you very much, Jen.
Thank you.
We are right on schedule. That's all the time we have for questions at this time. Again, please continue to write any questions in. We'll happily follow up with Jen and get answers out to everyone. And now it's Jen, you had the challenge of presenting before everyone gets to go eat some lunch. That was a terrific presentation. Thank you very much. Our lunch break will be until 1 o'clock. And then following lunch, we have Food for Hackers, Battling Cyber Attacks on Canada's Vital Ag System session.